I'm Evangelia Dickens, 35, a Navy commander who earned my way from scholarship kid to the officer's table. For years, I picked up the tab, bailing out my parents, covering my sister's bills, even funding her wedding. But when my own family mocked me at that wedding, Dad calling me the black sheep and a failure in uniform, while guests laughed, I drew a line that changed everything. Ever been dismissed or humiliated by people you've carried for years? Tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I dive in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if you've ever had to stand your ground after being wronged, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and self-respect. What happened next might surprise you. Growing up in the Dickens household meant understanding your place in the hierarchy. Dad sold insurance, Mom hosted dinner parties, and appearances were everything. The neighbors knew us as the family with the perfectly manicured lawn and the Christmas lights that went up before Thanksgiving. What they didn't know was how every conversation at our dinner table revolved around who was succeeding and who was falling short. My sister Emma was born to fit this world. She had the kind of effortless beauty that made people turn their heads, the social grace that made every room feel warmer when she entered. By high school, she was homecoming queen, dating the quarterback, collecting college acceptance letters like trophies. I was 2 years younger, watching from the sidelines, trying to figure out where I belonged in a family that measured worth in popularity contests and marriage prospects. When I mentioned wanting to join the military, Dad laughed it off as teenage rebellion. "It's just a phase," he told Mom over coffee one morning, not bothering to lower his voice even though I was right there. "She'll grow out of it once she meets the right boy." Mom nodded, already planning my future around sorority mixers and engagement parties that existed only in her imagination. But I wasn't rebelling. I was reaching for something they couldn't understand, a life built on merit, where your value came from what you could do, not who you knew or how well you fit into their narrow definition of success. I spent my junior year researching the Naval Academy, studying for the entrance exams while Emma planned her prom dress. When the acceptance letter arrived, the silence at dinner lasted a full minute before Dad cleared his throat and said, "Well, I suppose it's good to have options." The academy was everything I'd hoped for and nothing my family expected. I thrived in an environment where precision mattered, where your efforts translated directly into results. My classmates became the siblings I'd never had, people who understood that discipline wasn't punishment but freedom, that structure created space for excellence. I graduated third in my class, commissioned as an ensign, and called home with the news. "That's nice, honey," Mom said, distracted. "Emma's got some exciting news too. She's been accepted to that marketing program in New York." It became a pattern. Every achievement I earned was matched by something Emma had done, every milestone minimized by comparison to her latest social success. When I made lieutenant, Emma had gotten engaged to her college boyfriend. When I earned my surface warfare qualification, Emma had landed a job at a prestigious firm. The family narrative was clear. Emma was soaring while I was just playing dress-up in a uniform. What they didn't mention was how often I soared to their rescue. The call came at 2 a.m. during my first deployment. Dad's business was failing, and they needed $20,000 to keep the house. I wired the money from a port in Japan, using savings I'd accumulated by living in cramped quarters and eating military rations while Emma spent her weekends at wine tastings. 6 months later, it was Mom's medical bills. Then Emma's student loans. Then the roof repairs, the car payments, the endless stream of emergencies that somehow always required my help. I never said no. That was my role in the family ecosystem, the dependable one, the problem solver, the safety net they could count on without having to acknowledge what I provided. They took my financial support as naturally as they took my mother's cooking or my father's lectures about responsibility. It was just what I did, who I was supposed to be. Emma's career flourished in Manhattan while I served aboard destroyers in the Persian Gulf. She posted Instagram photos from rooftop parties while I navigated through shipping lanes in the Red Sea. Her life looked like something from a magazine. Mine was measured in months away from shore, in emergency drills at 3 a.m, in the satisfaction of keeping 300 sailors safe in waters where safety was never guaranteed. But when I came home on leave, the conversations always returned to Emma's latest triumph. She'd been promoted again. She was seeing someone new. She'd been invited to some exclusive event. My stories of port visits and training exercises were met with polite nods and quick subject changes. It was as if my entire career was happening in a parallel universe that occasionally intersected with theirs when they needed money. The dynamic crystallized during Emma's engagement announcement dinner. She'd been dating Marcus for 2 years, and everyone loved him. Harvard MBA, law firm partnership track, family money that went back 3 generations. He was exactly the kind of man our parents had always envisioned for their daughters, the kind of success story that validated their entire worldview. "We're thinking a spring wedding," Emma announced, holding up her left hand to display a diamond that caught the restaurant's dim lighting. "Something elegant, but not too formal. Marcus has such wonderful taste." The congratulations flowed like champagne. Dad talked about walking his daughter down the aisle. Mom started planning guest lists, and I sat there in my dress uniform. I'd come straight from a Navy event, watching my family celebrate the life they'd always wanted for me but never thought I could achieve. "What about you, Evangelia?" Emma asked, turning to me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Any prospects on the horizon? You're not getting any younger." The question hung in the air like smoke from Dad's cigars. At 35, I was a lieutenant commander with a distinguished service record, qualified to command a naval vessel, trusted with multi-million-dollar equipment and the lives of my crew. But in my family's estimation, I was just an aging woman in uniform, playing at a career that didn't include the only achievements that mattered to them. "I'm focused on my work right now," I said, keeping my voice level. "We're doing important things in the Pacific Fleet." "Of course you are," Dad said, patting my shoulder with the kind of condescension usually reserved for children playing pretend. "But don't wait too long, sweetheart. The good ones don't stay on the market forever." Emma's engagement became the center of our family's universe, a gravitational force that pulled every conversation back to wedding plans and future possibilities. I watched from the periphery, sending checks when requested, offering help when needed, playing my assigned role as the dependable sister who could be counted on for support but never quite celebrated for success. They had built their version of my story, and nothing I accomplished seemed capable of changing it. I was the family's safety net, the responsible one who chose career over marriage, duty over happiness. It was a narrative that served their needs perfectly, even as it erased everything I had actually become. The first warning signs appeared during Emma's bridal shower, hosted at Mom's country club among women who'd known our family for decades. I'd arranged my leave schedule to be there, driving 6 hours from Norfolk in my civilian clothes, carrying a carefully chosen gift that had required 3 months of deployment pay. "Oh, Evangelia made it," Mrs. Henderson exclaimed as I walked into the private dining room. "We were wondering if the Navy would let you out for such an important day." The comment was delivered with a smile, but I caught the undercurrent. In their world, my career was something that happened to me, not something I'd built through years of deliberate choices and earned accomplishments. They saw me as a woman playing at soldier, not a naval officer who'd earned her rank through proven competence. Emma glowed in the center of it all, opening gifts and accepting congratulations with the kind of gracious ease that had always made me feel like I was watching a performance I'd never learned to give. When she opened my present, a set of crystal glasses I'd found at a boutique in San Diego, she held them up to the light and smiled. "These are beautiful, Evangelia. Very practical." The word practical carried weight, a coded message that everyone in the room understood. Evangelia gives practical gifts because Evangelia is a practical person, useful but not inspiring, dependable but not exciting. Later, during the gift-opening commentary that always followed these events, I listened to the women dissect each present like art critics examining paintings. Emma's college friends had given her lingerie and weekend getaways, items that celebrated her upcoming role as a wife. Her coworkers had chosen designer accessories and spa treatments, gifts that acknowledged her success and sophistication. My practical glasses were mentioned once, filed away in the category of necessary but unremarkable contributions. I sat there in my carefully chosen outfit, a dress I'd bought specifically for occasions like this, and felt like an anthropologist studying a culture I'd never quite learned to navigate. "Evangelia's always been so responsible," Mom said to Mrs. Patterson, her voice carrying the particular tone she used when she wanted to sound proud, but couldn't quite manage genuine enthusiasm. "She's done so well in her chosen path." Her chosen path. As if my career was a walking trail I'd selected for weekend recreation, not a profession that had taken me around the world and earned me the respect of people whose opinions actually mattered to me. But in this room, surrounded by women who measured success in wedding invitations and country club memberships, my achievements translated as polite conversation topics, interesting but ultimately irrelevant to the business of living a proper life. Emma caught my eye across the room and smiled, the kind of smile she'd perfected in childhood when she wanted something. "Evangelia's been so helpful with all the wedding planning," she announced to the room. "She's contributing so much to make this day perfect." Contributing. The word hung in the air like a price tag, a reminder that my role in this family story was financial support wrapped in the language of sisterly love. I'd already written checks for the photographer, the flowers, and part of the venue deposit. But somehow, in Emma's telling, this became helpful contribution rather than the mathematical reality of one sister subsidizing another's dream wedding. After the shower, as I helped Mom clean up the dining room, she turned to me with the expression she wore when she was about to offer unwanted advice disguised as maternal concern. "You know, honey, Emma's wedding might be a good opportunity for you to meet someone. Marcus has several unmarried friends, very successful men who might appreciate someone with your sense of responsibility." My sense of responsibility. It was becoming my defining characteristic in their vocabulary, the polite way of acknowledging that I had money and reliability while avoiding any mention of how I'd earned both. They saw me as a woman with useful qualities who might, with proper positioning, attract a man willing to overlook my advanced age and unconventional career choices. "I'm not looking to meet anyone right now," I said, folding napkins with the precision I'd learned from military training. "My career keeps me pretty busy." "Of course it does, dear. But you can't sail around the ocean forever. Eventually, you'll want to settle down, have a family of your own." The assumption that my current life was temporary, a phase I'd outgrow once I came to my senses and embraced the path they'd always envisioned for me, had become a constant background hum in our conversations. They genuinely couldn't imagine that I'd found fulfillment in a life they didn't understand, that my definition of success might be fundamentally different from theirs. Emma called me 2 weeks later, her voice bright with excitement about some detail of the wedding planning that required immediate attention and financial assistance. "The caterer needs another deposit, and Marcus and I are a little tight right now with the down payment on the house. Could you possibly help us out?" "Just temporarily, of course." Just temporarily. It was always just temporarily, just this once, just until they got back on their feet. I'd been hearing those words for 10 years, ever since my first deployment when they'd discovered that their responsible daughter had actually become someone with both the means and the willingness to solve their problems. "How much do you need?" I asked, already calculating how much I could transfer from my savings without compromising my own financial security. "5,000 should cover it." "You're such a lifesaver, Evangelia. I don't know what we'd do without you." What they'd do without me was make different choices, live within their means, face the consequences of their financial decisions like adults. But I'd trained them to expect my intervention, taught them that their crises would always find solutions in my checkbook. I was the family's emergency fund, the safety net that allowed them to take risks they couldn't afford because they knew I'd catch them if they fell. The wedding preparations continued through the spring, a steady drumbeat of expenses and expectations that seemed to expand every time I thought we'd reached the final budget. Emma's vision kept growing more elaborate, more expensive, more perfect. The practical sister would handle the practical details while the beautiful sister focused on being beautiful. And through it all, the comments grew sharper, more pointed. Jokes about my single status became more frequent. Observations about my career became more dismissive. It was as if my willingness to financially support their dreams had given them permission to openly devalue the life I'd built for myself. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very success that enabled me to help them was the success they couldn't quite bring themselves to celebrate. Wedding day arrived with the kind of perfect weather that photographers charge extra to guarantee. I stood in front of my hotel room mirror, adjusting the ribbons on my service dress blues for the third time. The uniform was pressed to regulation standards, each decoration positioned with mathematical precision, brass polished to mirror brightness. I looked like exactly what I was, a naval officer prepared for a formal occasion. But walking into the church vestibule, I immediately felt the weight of disapproving glances. Whispers followed me down the hallway, comments delivered behind hands, but loud enough to ensure I'd hear them. She's wearing her uniform to Emma's wedding? Seems a bit much, don't you think? Always has to make it about herself. The logic was stunning in its circularity. If I'd worn civilian clothes, I would have been criticized for not showing proper respect for the occasion. By wearing my dress uniform, the military equivalent of a tuxedo, I was somehow stealing attention from the bride. There was no correct choice, no version of my presence that wouldn't generate commentary about my failure to read the room properly. Emma appeared in the doorway, radiant in white silk and lace, surrounded by bridesmaids in dusty pink who'd spent the morning having their hair arranged in identical cascades of curls. She spotted me immediately, her smile faltering for just a moment before she composed herself and walked over. "Evangelia, you look very official," she said, the word landing somewhere between compliment and criticism. "I wasn't sure you'd be able to get leave for the whole weekend." "I wouldn't miss your wedding," I replied, meaning it despite everything. Whatever complicated feelings existed between us, she was still my sister, and this was still the most important day of her life. "Of course not. You've been so involved in making this happen." Again, that coded language that transformed financial contribution into emotional investment that made my support sound like enthusiasm rather than duty. The ceremony was everything Emma had dreamed of: flowers arranged in perfect abundance, music performed by a string quartet, vows delivered in voices that carried clearly to the back row. Marcus looked appropriately handsome and nervous, Emma looked radiant, and I sat in the family section watching my sister marry a man who could give her the life our parents had always wanted for both their daughters. During the reception, I found myself seated at a table with distant relatives and family friends, people who knew me primarily as Emma's sister in the Navy. They asked polite questions about my career, the kind of questions people ask when they want to appear interested without actually learning anything meaningful about your life. "Do you enjoy all that traveling?" asked Uncle Robert, Emma's godfather, a man who'd built his fortune in real estate development. "The deployments are challenging but rewarding," I answered. "There's something meaningful about serving alongside people who share your commitment to something larger than themselves." He nodded with the expression people wear when they're waiting for you to finish talking so they can change the subject. "Well, I'm sure it's been a good experience for you." Character building. Character building. As if my career was summer camp, a temporary adventure that would end once I came to my senses and settled into a more appropriate life. I'd commanded sailors through emergency situations in international waters, made decisions that affected the safety of multi-million-dollar vessels, earned the respect of officers who'd spent their entire careers evaluating competence and leadership. But in this room, surrounded by my family's social circle, those experiences translated as character building, interesting stories that might make me a more well-rounded dinner party guest. The evening wore on, and the alcohol flowed freely. Dad's voice grew louder, his gestures more expansive, his commentary more pointed. He held court at the head table, telling stories about Emma's childhood, her academic achievements, her success in New York, her excellent choice in husbands. Each story painted a picture of a daughter who'd fulfilled every parental dream, who'd chosen wisely and lived properly. When the conversation turned to me, the tone shifted noticeably. Dad's voice carried a note of resignation mixed with gentle mockery, the way you might talk about a family member who'd made peculiar but ultimately harmless life choices. "Evangelia's always been our independent one," he said, gesturing toward me with his wine glass. "Never could convince her to follow the traditional path. Stubborn as hell, just like her mother." The comparison to Mom was meant as a compliment, but it carried implications that made me shift in my seat. Mom's stubbornness had been channeled into appropriate outlets, charity work, social organizing, maintaining the kind of household that reflected well on Dad's success. My stubbornness had led me to a career that took me away from home, that prioritized duty over family obligations, that failed to produce the grandchildren they'd been expecting for 15 years. She's done well for herself, though, Dad continued, his voice taking on the tone he used when he wanted to sound magnanimous. Made something of that military thing. We're proud of her, even if we don't always understand her choices. Even if we don't always understand her choices. The qualifier hung in the air like a disclaimer, a way of expressing pride while maintaining distance from the decisions that had shaped my life. They could be proud of my success without having to approve of the path I'd taken to achieve it. Emma raised her glass, catching the room's attention with the kind of effortless grace that had always made public speaking look easy for her. I just want to thank everyone who's made this day so special. My parents, who taught me what love looks like in a marriage that's lasted 32 years. My friends, who've supported me through everything. And my sister Evangelia, who's always been there when I needed her, even when the Navy kept her on the other side of the world. The applause was warm and genuine, but I heard the subtext clearly. I'd always been there when she needed me financially, logistically, practically. The dependable sister who could be counted on for support, but who lived her real life somewhere else, in a world they didn't understand and couldn't quite bring themselves to celebrate. As the evening progressed and the toasts became more informal, the family's sense of humor began to target my unmarried status with increasing directness. Cousins made jokes about my dedication to the Navy being a substitute for romantic commitment. Aunts offered to set me up with their divorced friends' brothers. Everyone had an opinion about my biological clock, my career priorities, my apparent inability to balance professional success with personal fulfillment. Dad, emboldened by champagne and the appreciative audience of wedding guests, decided to offer his own analysis of my life choices. He stood up, glass in hand, with the confident smile of a man who believed his wisdom would be both welcome and enlightening. You know, Evangelia's always been the black sheep of this family, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the reception hall. Smart as hell, don't get me wrong, but she never could figure out what the rest of us knew instinctively. She's just a failure in uniform, playing at being something she's not. The words hit me like a physical blow, delivered with casual cruelty in front of people who'd watched me grow up, who'd known me since childhood. A failure in uniform. The phrase crystallized years of subtle dismissal into something sharp and undeniable, a public declaration that my achievements were pretense, my career a form of elaborate dress-up that had gone on too long to be charming anymore. Emma laughed, a sound that might have been nervous, but came out as endorsement of Dad's assessment. Yeah, imagine being almost 40 with no husband, no kids. What's the point of all that success if you're still alone? The laughter that followed wasn't malicious, exactly, but it was complicit. These were people who'd known me since I was a child, who'd watched me graduate from high school, leave for the academy, return home in uniform with stories of places they'd never been and responsibilities they'd never carried. And their response to my father's public humiliation was amusement, as if his cruelty was just another form of family entertainment. I sat there in my dress uniform, surrounded by ribbons that represented years of service, decorations that marked achievements these people couldn't begin to understand, and felt something inside me break. Not my composure, years of military training had taught me to maintain control under pressure far greater than family dysfunction. But something deeper broke, some fundamental expectation that blood relationships carried inherent respect, that family meant protection rather than vulnerability. The conversation moved on, as conversations do, but the damage was done. Dad had said publicly what I'd always suspected they believed privately, that my life was a performance. My achievements were consolation prizes for failing to achieve the only success that mattered to them. I was approaching 40 with no husband, no children, no evidence that I'd learned how to live properly despite all their patient instruction over the years. I excused myself quietly, walking to the women's restroom with the measured pace I'd learned to maintain when everything inside me wanted to run. In the mirror, I looked exactly like what I was, a naval officer in dress uniform, professional and composed. But behind the reflection, I could see the truth Dad had articulated so clearly. In my family's estimation, I was a failure who'd spent 20 years pretending otherwise. The restroom door opened behind me, and Commander Patricia Hughes walked in, her own dress uniform impeccable despite the long evening. Pat was Marcus's Naval Academy roommate's wife, someone I'd met briefly during the cocktail hour, but hadn't had time to really talk with. "Tough crowd," she said simply, moving to the sink beside mine. "Family weddings bring out everyone's opinions," I replied, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Your father's an ass," Pat said matter-of-factly, checking her lipstick in the mirror. "Anyone with eyes can see you've earned every stripe on those sleeves." The simple statement of support nearly undid me completely. Here was someone who understood what those stripes meant, who could read the ribbons on my chest like a resume written in a language my family had never bothered to learn. She knew, without explanation or qualification, that my achievements were real, that my career represented genuine accomplishment rather than elaborate make-believe. "Thanks," I managed, my voice rougher than I'd intended. 22 years active duty, Pat continued, adjusting her collar with the same automatic precision I'd just performed with my own. 3 deployments to the Gulf, 2 commendations for leadership under fire, and a reputation that precedes you in every naval circle I've ever moved in. Your family's loss is the Navy's gain." She knew my service record. Somehow, in the brief conversation we'd shared during cocktails, she'd recognized my name and connected it to a career that had meaning in her world, even if it was invisible in mine. The validation hit me harder than Dad's insult, because it came from someone whose opinion was based on professional knowledge rather than personal disappointment. "The uniform looks good on you, Commander," Pat said as she headed for the door. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." I stood alone in the restroom for another few minutes, collecting myself and preparing to return to a celebration where I was both essential and unwelcome, valued for my financial contributions, but dismissed for my life choices. The woman in the mirror looked exactly the same as she had 20 minutes earlier, but something had shifted internally, some recognition that the respect I'd been seeking from my family might be fundamentally unavailable, not because I hadn't earned it, but because they lacked the capacity to offer it. When I returned to the reception hall, the party was in full swing. Marcus was making rounds to thank guests personally, Emma was dancing with Dad to their traditional father-daughter song, and the evening was proceeding exactly as planned. I took my seat at the family table, straightened my uniform jacket, and prepared to endure the remaining hours with whatever dignity I could maintain. But something had changed in my absence. Marcus had noticed the dynamic, had perhaps overheard enough of the family's commentary to understand what was happening. He caught my eye across the room, and I saw something in his expression that I hadn't expected: recognition, respect, and a kind of professional solidarity that transcended family politics. He finished his conversation with Emma's college roommates and walked across the reception hall with purposeful strides. When he reached my table, he stopped directly in front of my chair, came to attention with military precision, and delivered a salute that silenced the entire room. "Commander," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "It's an honor." The silence that followed was profound, the kind of quiet that falls when everyone in a room realizes they've been fundamentally wrong about something important. Marcus held the salute until I returned it, a brief exchange of military courtesy that reframed every conversation that had preceded it. Here was Emma's new husband, the Harvard MBA with the perfect pedigree and the family money, offering the kind of respect that my own family had withheld for 20 years. He understood what those ribbons meant, what my rank represented, what it cost to earn the uniform I wore. And he was making that understanding public, in front of people who'd just finished laughing at my father's assessment of my life as failure disguised as service. "The honor is mine," I replied, completing the exchange with the professionalism that had become second nature after 2 decades in uniform. Marcus smiled and extended his hand for a civilian handshake. "I've heard excellent things about your command. The Pacific Fleet speaks very highly of your leadership." The Pacific Fleet speaks very highly of your leadership. The words hung in the air like a revelation, information about my professional life that my family had never sought and would never have found on their own. Marcus knew things about my career that Dad couldn't have articulated, understood aspects of my service that Mom had never asked about, respected achievements that Emma had never bothered to investigate. "Thank you," I said simply, shaking his hand with the firm grip I'd perfected in countless similar exchanges with fellow officers. "I should have introduced myself properly earlier," Marcus continued, his voice pitched for the table, but audible to the nearby guests who were still processing what they'd just witnessed. "Marcus Sullivan, Lieutenant Colonel, Judge Advocate General's Corps, Army Reserve." Lieutenant Colonel. Marcus wasn't just a successful civilian who happened to know something about military courtesy. He was a field-grade officer, someone whose rank actually exceeded mine, someone who understood military culture from the inside. His salute hadn't been a gesture of politeness, it had been one professional acknowledging another, with the full weight of military protocol behind it. The revelation rippled through the family table like a seismic shift. Suddenly, Marcus wasn't just Emma's successful husband. He was someone whose judgment of my career carried weight they couldn't dismiss. He'd looked at my service record and found it worthy of respect, had evaluated my achievements according to standards they didn't understand but couldn't argue with. Dad cleared his throat, the way he did when he realized he'd miscalculated something important. "Well, Marcus, we didn't know you were military yourself." "Reserve component," Marcus replied easily. "Weekend warrior compared to Commander Dickens's service. She's the real deal. Active duty line officer, multiple command qualifications, deployment ribbons that represent serious time in harm's way. That's the kind of service that builds the backbone of our national defense." Each phrase was a small education for my family, a translation of my career into terms they couldn't dismiss as easily as they dismissed my own explanations over the years. Marcus possessed both the military knowledge to evaluate my achievements and the social standing within their world to make that evaluation matter. "Evangelia's always been very dedicated to her work," Mom said carefully, using the diplomatic tone she employed when she wasn't sure what reaction was appropriate. "Dedication is part of it," Marcus agreed. "But command at sea requires something more. The ability to make life-and-death decisions under pressure, to earn the trust of sailors who will follow your orders into dangerous situations, to represent American interests in some of the most complex geopolitical environments in the world. It's not work you can fake your way through." The educational component of his comments was deliberate, I realized. Marcus was giving my family information they'd never sought, context they'd never bothered to acquire, perspective that transformed my career from family disappointment into something that demanded respect. He was doing it diplomatically, without directly criticizing their previous dismissiveness, but the message was unmistakable. Emma appeared beside him, having finished her dance with Dad, her expression uncertain as she tried to read the mood at the table. "What's everyone talking about so seriously? This is supposed to be a party." "Just getting to know your sister better," Marcus said, sliding his arm around Emma's waist with easy affection. I had no idea the family included such distinguished military service. "You should be very proud. You should be very proud." The words carried an implicit rebuke, gentle but clear. Marcus was telling them, politely but unmistakably, that their treatment of me reflected poorly on their judgment rather than on my achievements. He was using his position as the new son-in-law, his military credentials, and his obvious success in their world to reframe the entire dynamic. "We are proud," Dad said quickly, his voice carrying the slight strain of someone adjusting his position mid-conversation. "We've always been proud of Evangelia's service." But the damage to his earlier assessment was already done. 20 minutes earlier, he'd called me a failure in uniform in front of a room full of people. Now, faced with Marcus's professional evaluation of my career, he was claiming pride he'd never expressed, respect he'd never offered, support he'd never provided. The contradiction was visible to everyone at the table, the gap between his public humiliation of me and his current claim of parental pride. Marcus's intervention had accomplished something I'd never managed in 20 years of service. It had forced my family to confront the disconnect between their treatment of my career and its actual significance. I'm sure the commander has some incredible stories, Marcus continued, including me in the conversation with the kind of professional courtesy that acknowledged my expertise. The Pacific deployment tempo has been intense these past few years. It was an opening, an invitation to share aspects of my experience that my family had never asked about. But I'd learned long ago that they weren't genuinely interested in my stories, that their questions about my career were typically prelude to advice about when I should leave it behind for more appropriate pursuits. It keeps us busy, I said diplomatically, falling back on the neutral responses I'd perfected for occasions when military service became a topic of civilian curiosity. I'll bet it does, Marcus replied with the kind of understanding that came from shared experience. The operational tempo doesn't leave much time for the home front. The home front. He'd just acknowledged, in language my family couldn't misinterpret, that my absence from their social obligations wasn't personal choice, but professional necessity. That my limited availability for wedding planning and family gatherings reflected the demands of genuine service rather than deliberate avoidance. The evening continued, but something fundamental had shifted in the family dynamic. Marcus's public recognition of my achievements had created a new baseline for how my service could be discussed, had established that dismissing my career meant disagreeing with someone whose opinion they valued and whose judgment they trusted. Other guests approached throughout the evening, drawn by curiosity about the military exchange they'd witnessed. Marcus's introduction had given them permission to ask questions they might not have asked otherwise, to express interest in aspects of my career that had previously been invisible to them. "Commander Dickens," said Mrs. Patterson, one of Mom's bridge partners, approaching with the kind of tentative respect usually reserved for meeting minor celebrities. "Marcus mentioned you've been stationed overseas. That must be quite an adventure." Adventure. It was a civilian word for what I did, lacking the weight of actual understanding, but it was delivered with genuine interest rather than the patronizing dismissal I'd grown accustomed to from my family's social circle. Marcus's intervention had transformed me from Emma's peculiar sister into someone worth getting to know. "It's been rewarding," I replied, offering the kind of safe response that acknowledged her interest without overwhelming her with details she probably wouldn't understand or remember. "I imagine it takes tremendous courage," she continued, clearly working through concepts that were foreign to her experience. "Being responsible for all those young people so far from home. Tremendous courage." The phrase hit me unexpectedly, simple recognition of something my family had never acknowledged. Mrs. Patterson, a woman whose biggest risk in recent years had probably been trying a new recipe for book club, understood intuitively that my career involved forms of responsibility and danger that required qualities worth admiring. The acknowledgement from someone outside my family carried weight precisely because it came without obligation, without the complicated dynamics that made genuine recognition impossible from people who'd known me since childhood. Mrs. Patterson had no investment in maintaining a particular version of my story, no need to protect her previous judgments, no reason to offer false praise. Her respect, limited though it might be, was authentic. As the reception wound down and guests began saying their goodbyes, I found myself in the unusual position of being someone people sought out rather than someone they politely acknowledged before moving on to more interesting conversations. Marcus's intervention had created space for interactions that had never been possible before, had established my credibility in ways that years of trying to explain my career had never accomplished. The power of external validation was both satisfying and deeply unsettling. For 20 years, I'd sought recognition from people whose opinions shouldn't have mattered more than the respect I'd earned from colleagues who actually understood what I did for a living. But their dismissal had shaped my sense of worth in ways I'd never fully acknowledged, had created a hunger for family approval that no amount of professional success had been able to satisfy. Marcus's salute had fed that hunger, but it had also revealed its futility. The recognition I'd received hadn't come from any change in my family's understanding or appreciation of my achievements. It had come from an outsider's intervention, from someone with enough social standing and professional credibility to force them to reconsider judgments they'd been comfortable with for decades. The validation was real, but it was also borrowed, dependent on Marcus's continued presence and willingness to serve as translator between my world and theirs. Without his intervention, they would return to their comfortable dismissal of my choices, their gentle mockery of my priorities, their assumption that my career was ultimately a form of extended adolescence that would end when I finally came to my senses. But something had changed inside me during those few moments of silence after Marcus's salute. Some recognition that the respect I'd been seeking was finally available, but not from the sources I'd expected. The people whose opinions actually mattered, my fellow officers, my sailors, the professionals who could evaluate my performance based on knowledge rather than prejudice, had been offering that respect all along. I'd just been too focused on winning approval from people who lacked the capacity to give it meaningfully to notice that I already had what I'd been seeking, just not from the sources I'd expected. The revelation was both liberating and painful, recognition that I'd wasted years trying to prove myself to judges who were fundamentally unqualified to evaluate the evidence. As Emma and Marcus prepared to leave for their honeymoon, the family gathered for final photographs and farewells. The photographer arranged us in traditional groupings, parents with children, siblings together, extended family clusters that would document this milestone for future generations. I stood where directed, smiled when instructed, and participated in the ritual of preserving memories that would probably hang in their living room for decades. But the dynamic had shifted subtly throughout the evening. Where conversations with me had previously been brief and superficial, people now lingered, asked follow-up questions, seemed genuinely interested in my responses. Marcus's intervention had created a new social reality where my career was something worth discussing rather than something to be politely acknowledged before changing the subject. Dad approached me as the evening wound down, his expression carrying the particular combination of uncertainty and determination that indicated he was preparing to address something he'd been avoiding. "Evangelia, about what I said earlier during the toasts." "It's fine, Dad," I interrupted, not ready for whatever form of non-apology he was constructing. "It's been a long day for everyone." "No, it's not fine," he insisted, his voice lower than usual. "Marcus helped me understand some things about your service that I hadn't fully appreciated." I spoke out of turn. It was as close to an apology as Dad was capable of offering, acknowledgement that his public assessment of my career had been inappropriate without quite admitting that it had been cruel or ignorant. He was giving me an opening to accept his limited contrition and move forward as if the damage could be easily repaired. "I appreciate that," I said carefully, neither accepting nor rejecting his attempt at reconciliation. "Marcus has a good perspective on military service." "He does indeed," Dad agreed, seizing on the diplomatic language I'd offered. "Makes me realize we probably don't ask you enough questions about your work. Maybe we should remedy that." The suggestion hung between us like a tentative bridge, an offer to show interest he'd never demonstrated before, to learn about aspects of my life he'd dismissed for 20 years. But the offer came only after an outsider had forced him to recognize the value of what he'd been ignoring, only after his public dismissal of my achievements had been contradicted by someone whose opinion he couldn't easily discount. "I'd like that," I replied, because it was true even though I doubted his follow-through. "There's a lot about the Navy that doesn't translate easily to civilian conversation." "I'm sure there is," he said, nodding with the earnest expression he wore when he was trying to appear more thoughtful than he actually felt. We'll make more effort to understand." The promise was vague enough to be meaningless, specific enough to sound genuine, and conditional enough to be abandoned without consequence when his temporary motivation faded. But it was progress of a sort, recognition that understanding required effort he hadn't been willing to invest previously. The conversation ended there, both of us recognizing the limitations of what could be accomplished in a hotel hallway at the end of a long evening. But something had been acknowledged, some recognition that the dynamic between us needed adjustment, that his assessment of my life had been based on incomplete information and cultural assumptions that didn't account for the reality of what I actually did for a living. Emma found me as I was gathering my things to leave, her wedding dress carefully bustled for easier movement, her makeup still perfect despite hours of celebration. She looked exactly like the fairy tale bride she'd always dreamed of becoming, surrounded by evidence of a day that had exceeded even her considerable expectations. "Thank you for everything you did to make this happen," she said, her voice carrying genuine gratitude mixed with something that might have been awkwardness. "I know you contributed so much, both financially and otherwise." Both financially and otherwise. Even in her moment of gratitude, she couldn't quite bring herself to be specific about what my otherwise contributions had been, couldn't articulate that I'd absorbed family criticism, endured public humiliation, and maintained grace under pressure that would have broken someone with less training and emotional discipline. "It was a beautiful wedding," I replied, focusing on the objective truth that her day had been everything she'd wanted it to be. "You looked radiant, and Marcus seems like a good man." "He is," she agreed, her face lighting up with the kind of happiness that made her earlier cruelty seem like temporary insanity rather than deliberate malice. "And he was so sweet to say those things about your career." I had no idea he knew anything about military stuff. She had no idea he knew anything about military stuff. The statement revealed the fundamental gap that had shaped our relationship for decades. She'd never bothered to learn enough about my career to recognize when someone else possessed relevant knowledge, had never developed the vocabulary necessary to distinguish between genuine professional respect and polite civilian interest. "Military officers tend to know about each other's service," I explained patiently. "Especially at the senior levels. It's a smaller community than most people realize." "That makes sense," she said, nodding as if this information was both new and fascinating. "Maybe you could tell me more about it sometime." "About what you actually do, I mean. I realize I don't really understand it very well." "Maybe you could tell me more about it sometime." The offer carried the same tentative quality as Dad's earlier promise, the same suggestion that interest could be developed retroactively, that 20 years of dismissive indifference could be overcome through good intentions and occasional conversations. "I'd be happy to," I said, meaning it despite my skepticism about her follow-through. "There's a lot about naval operations that doesn't make it into civilian news coverage." "I'm sure there is," she replied, then glanced around the reception hall with the distracted attention of someone who had other priorities demanding her focus. "Well, Marcus and I should probably get going. Early flight tomorrow." The conversation ended as it had begun, with polite expressions of interest that carried no obligation for future action, with promises that probably wouldn't survive their honeymoon, with goodwill that felt genuine in the moment but lacked the foundation necessary for sustained change. I drove back to my hotel through streets that looked different in the darkness, past houses where families were probably having normal conversations about normal problems, where adult children weren't required to financially subsidize their siblings' wedding dreams or endure public assessments of their worth from people who'd never bothered to understand their achievements. The evening had been a victory of sorts, but it was someone else's victory, won by Marcus's intervention rather than my own efforts, dependent on his continued presence and willingness to serve as translator between my world and theirs. Without him, they would return to their comfortable patterns of dismissal, their assumption that my career was ultimately a form of elaborate hobby that had gone on too long to be charming. But something had shifted in my own understanding, some recognition that the validation I'd been seeking was available, just not from the sources I'd expected. Marcus had demonstrated that people existed who could evaluate my achievements fairly, who possessed both the knowledge and the respect necessary to appreciate what I'd accomplished. The fact that those people weren't my family was disappointing but not ultimately damaging. I'd spent 20 years trying to prove myself to judges who were fundamentally unqualified to evaluate the evidence, who lacked both the professional knowledge and the emotional capacity to offer the recognition I'd been seeking. Their dismissal said more about their limitations than about my achievements, more about their narrow definition of success than about the actual value of my service. The realization was both liberating and melancholy, recognition that I could stop seeking approval from people who would never be capable of giving it meaningfully. But it was also acknowledgement that the family relationships I'd valued were built on foundations that couldn't support the weight of genuine mutual respect, that their love for me was conditional on my willingness to accept their judgment of my choices. Marcus's salute had been a gift, but it had also been a revelation about what I'd been missing and where I might find it. The respect I'd been seeking existed in abundance among people who understood what I did for a living, who could read my service record like a resume written in a language they understood, who valued achievements my family would never learn to appreciate. The next morning, I packed my dress uniform carefully, each ribbon positioned exactly as regulations required, brass polished to the standard I'd maintained for 20 years. In the hotel mirror, I looked like exactly what I was, a naval officer preparing to return to duty, to responsibilities that mattered to people whose opinions were based on professional knowledge rather than family dynamics. The uniform that had made me feel like an outsider at my sister's wedding was the same uniform that commanded respect in every professional environment I'd ever entered. The disconnect wasn't with my career, it was with my family's ability to understand what that career represented, what it required, what it had accomplished. I drove to the airport thinking about the difference between borrowed validation and earned respect, between approval from people who mattered to me personally and recognition from people who were qualified to judge my performance professionally. Marcus's intervention had forced my family to acknowledge my achievements temporarily, but their capacity for sustained appreciation remained questionable. What wasn't questionable was my own capacity to continue serving regardless of their approval, to find satisfaction in work that mattered independently of their ability to understand or appreciate it. The uniform I wore represented commitments that transcended family expectations, achievements that existed regardless of their recognition, service that would continue long after their temporary interest faded. The flight back to Norfolk gave me time to process what had happened, to understand both the victory and its limitations. Marcus had given me something I'd been seeking for 20 years, but he'd also revealed that I'd been seeking it from the wrong sources, that the validation I needed was available but not from the people I'd expected to provide it. Months passed before the next family contact, time that allowed the wedding evening to settle into memory and take on the weight that important moments acquire with distance. When Emma called, her voice carried the bright energy of someone who'd returned from an extended honeymoon with stories to tell and energy to burn. "Marcus and I have been talking," she began, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been nervousness. "About the wedding, about some of the things that happened that night. Some of the things that happened that night." The euphemistic language was typical of how our family addressed uncomfortable topics, indirectly, with enough ambiguity to allow multiple interpretations, with sufficient vagueness to avoid taking responsibility for specific actions or statements. "It was a beautiful wedding," I replied, falling back on the diplomatic neutrality I'd perfected for navigating family conversations. "You looked radiant." "Thank you," she said, then paused in a way that suggested she was working through a script she'd prepared. "But Marcus helped me understand that maybe I haven't always been as supportive of your career as I should have been. Maybe I haven't always been as supportive of your career as I should have been." The acknowledgement was carefully worded, passive enough to avoid direct responsibility, qualified enough to suggest that any lack of support had been inadvertent rather than deliberate. It was progress, but progress that had been prompted by her husband's intervention rather than her own recognition. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied, neither accepting nor rejecting her attempt at reconciliation. "Military life isn't always easy for families to understand." "No, it's not," she agreed quickly, seizing on the excuse I'd offered. "And I realize now that we probably didn't make much effort to learn about what you actually do. Marcus has been educating me about military rank structure, about what it means to command a ship, about the kind of responsibility you carry." "Marcus has been educating me." The phrase revealed both the source of her newfound interest and its probable limitations. She was learning about my career secondhand, through her husband's explanations, rather than through direct curiosity about my experiences. Her understanding was borrowed, dependent on his continued willingness to serve as interpreter between my world and hers. "It's a complex field," I said diplomatically. "Most civilians don't have much reason to understand military operations." "Maybe not, but family should make the effort," she replied, the words carrying conviction that sounded genuine even if it had been prompted by outside influence. "I'd like to do better. To be more supportive. I'd like to do better. To be more supportive." The promise was vague enough to be meaningless, specific enough to sound sincere, and conditional enough to be abandoned without consequence when her motivation faded. But it was an acknowledgement that improvement was needed, recognition that her previous behavior had fallen short of what family support should look like. That would mean a lot to me, I said, because it was true even though I doubted her ability to sustain the effort. There's a lot about naval service that doesn't translate easily to civilian conversation. Marcus mentioned that. He said military families develop their own culture, their own way of understanding sacrifice and service. I never really thought about what it cost you to be away so much, to miss so many family things. What it cost you to be away so much. The acknowledgement hit harder than I'd expected, recognition of something she'd never considered before, that my absences weren't preference, but duty, that missing family events was sacrifice rather than choice, that my career required forms of commitment that made traditional family participation impossible. It's part of the job, I replied, falling back on the stoic acceptance that had become automatic over 20 years of service. Everyone in the military makes those sacrifices. But that doesn't make them easier, she insisted, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been genuine understanding. And it doesn't mean family should make them harder by not appreciating what you're giving up. And it doesn't mean family should make them harder. The statement was as close to an apology as Emma was capable of offering, acknowledgement that her behavior had added difficulty to sacrifices that were already substantial, that family should provide support rather than additional burden. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, touching on topics we'd never discussed before: deployment schedules, command responsibilities, the reality of military life that existed beyond the patriotic abstractions most civilians understood. Emma asked questions that suggested genuine interest, made observations that indicated she was actually listening to my answers. But the entire exchange was shadowed by its dependence on Marcus's influence, by the recognition that her newfound curiosity existed only because her husband had convinced her it was necessary. Without his continued presence and involvement, she would probably return to the comfortable indifference that had characterized our relationship for decades. Still, it was something. A beginning, perhaps, or at least an acknowledgement that beginning was necessary. The wedding had created a crisis that forced recognition of problems that had been ignored for years, had made visible the cost of treating family members as supporting characters in someone else's story rather than protagonists of their own lives. Dad's follow-up came in the form of an email, several paragraphs that had clearly been drafted and redrafted, edited for tone and content in ways that suggested consultation with Mom about appropriate language and acceptable levels of contrition. Evangelia, it began, I've been thinking about our conversation at the wedding, about some things I said that night that I regret. Marcus helped me understand that my comments about your career were inappropriate and based on ignorance rather than knowledge. Based on ignorance rather than knowledge. The phrase was accurate, but carefully chosen, acknowledging error without admitting malice, recognizing mistake without accepting responsibility for the emotional damage those mistakes had caused over 20 years of similar comments. I realize now that I never made the effort to truly understand what you do, what your rank means, what kind of responsibility and sacrifice your service represents. That's my failure, not yours, and I want to do better going forward. That's my failure, not yours. The acknowledgement was significant, recognition that the disconnect between us had been caused by his unwillingness to learn rather than my inability to explain. That the problem was his lack of curiosity rather than my failure to communicate effectively. Would you be willing to help me understand? Maybe you could explain what your current position involves, what your deployment schedule looks like, what kind of decisions you make in your role as a commander. I should have asked these questions years ago. Would you be willing to help me understand? The request was both reasonable and 20 years overdue, an offer to show interest that should have existed naturally, to learn about aspects of my life that should have been important to him because they were important to me. I stared at the email for several minutes before responding, weighing the sincerity of his offer against the pattern of dismissive indifference that had characterized our relationship since I'd chosen a path he couldn't understand. His motivation was clearly external. Marcus's intervention had forced recognition that couldn't be ignored, but his request seemed genuine even if it was borrowed. Dad, I wrote back, I'd be happy to help you understand my work better. It's a complex field, but I think you'd find some aspects interesting. The Navy operates in ways that might surprise you, and the responsibilities of command involve much more than most civilians realize. The correspondence that followed stretched over several months, emails that gradually built a vocabulary for discussing aspects of my career that had been invisible to my family for decades. Dad asked questions that suggested genuine effort to understand, made observations that indicated he was actually processing the information I provided. But the entire exchange felt fragile, dependent on his continued motivation and Marcus's ongoing influence. Without external pressure to maintain interest, he would probably return to the comfortable assumption that my career was something that happened to me rather than something I'd built through deliberate choices and sustained effort. The family dynamic had shifted, but the shift felt temporary, like a diplomatic agreement that would hold only as long as all parties remembered why it was necessary. Marcus had forced recognition of my achievements, but recognition that required ongoing external validation was inherently unstable, subject to change when priorities shifted or attention moved elsewhere. Still, it was progress. For the first time in 20 years, my family was making an effort to understand what I actually did for a living, to appreciate the kind of responsibility my rank represented, to recognize that my absences were sacrifice rather than preference. The effort was prompted by outside influence rather than natural curiosity, but it was genuine even if it was borrowed. More importantly, the wedding had taught me something about where to seek validation, about the difference between approval from people who mattered to me personally and respect from people who were qualified to judge my performance professionally. I'd spent decades trying to prove myself to judges who lacked the knowledge necessary to evaluate the evidence, who couldn't distinguish between achievement and failure because they didn't understand the standards that defined either. Marcus's salute had been significant not because it changed my family's opinion, but because it demonstrated that the respect I'd been seeking was available from people who understood what I'd accomplished, who could read my service record like a resume written in a language they understood fluently. The recognition I'd received that night was borrowed, but it had revealed the location of recognition I could earn independently, respect that existed in abundance among professionals who understood what my uniform represented, what my rank required, what my achievements had cost. 2 years after Emma's wedding, I received orders for a new assignment, command of a guided missile destroyer, the kind of position that represented the pinnacle of surface warfare officer careers. The ship was home port in San Diego, a move that would take me even further from family, but closer to operational responsibilities that defined why I'd chosen this life. I called to share the news, expecting the polite congratulations that had become standard for my professional milestones. Instead, Dad's response carried genuine enthusiasm, questions that indicated he'd retained some of the military vocabulary we'd built through our email exchanges. "Command at sea," he said, his voice carrying a note of pride that I'd never heard before. Marcus explained what that means, the kind of responsibility it represents. "Congratulations, Evangelia. That's a real achievement. That's a real achievement." The phrase hit me unexpectedly, simple recognition from someone whose opinion I'd sought for decades, acknowledgement that my career had produced something worthy of celebration rather than polite tolerance. "Thank you," I replied, meaning it in ways that encompassed more than just his specific congratulations. "It's what I've been working toward for 20 years. "I know," he said, and I could hear something in his voice that might have been regret. "I wish I'd understood that sooner. I wish I'd understood that sooner." The acknowledgement was both satisfying and melancholy, recognition of time lost and opportunities missed, of years when family support might have meant something different if it had been based on understanding rather than obligation. But it was also recognition that understanding, however delayed, was still valuable, that relationships could evolve even when the foundation had been damaged by decades of mutual incomprehension. Dad's education had been prompted by external pressure, but his willingness to learn seemed genuine even if it was overdue. The conversation ended with promises to stay in better touch, to share more details about my new responsibilities, to build on the foundation we'd established through months of careful correspondence. Whether those promises would survive the daily demands of his civilian life and my military obligations remained to be seen, but they represented possibility in ways that hadn't existed before Marcus's intervention. I hung up the phone thinking about the difference between borrowed validation and earned respect, about the power of external influence to create space for recognition that had been impossible when left to natural family dynamics. Marcus's salute had been a gift, but it had also been an education for my family about the value of what I'd accomplished, for me about where to seek the respect I'd been missing. The uniform I wore represented commitments that transcended family approval, achievements that existed independently of their recognition, service that would continue regardless of their ability to understand or appreciate it. But their belated effort to learn meant something, created possibility for relationships that had been constrained by ignorance and assumption. Standing in my new quarters overlooking San Diego Harbor, I could see destroyers and cruisers moving through shipping lanes that connected American naval power to strategic interests around the globe. Ships commanded by officers who'd earned their positions through proven competence, who carried responsibilities that most civilians couldn't comprehend, who found satisfaction in service that existed independently of public recognition or family approval. This was my world, populated by people who understood what I'd accomplished without translation, who could evaluate my performance based on professional knowledge rather than cultural assumptions, who offered respect that was earned rather than borrowed from external sources. The validation I'd sought from my family was finally available, but it was conditional and fragile, dependent on continued external pressure and sustained motivation that might fade when other priorities demanded their attention. The respect I'd found among my professional peers was unconditional and stable, based on shared understanding and mutual evaluation according to standards we all understood. Emma's wedding had taught me the difference between the two kinds of recognition, had revealed both the possibility and the limitations of seeking approval from people who lack the capacity to offer it meaningfully. Marcus's intervention had been valuable not because it changed my family permanently, but because it demonstrated where genuine respect was available and how to recognize when I was seeking validation from unqualified sources. The command I was assuming represented everything I'd worked toward for 20 years, responsibility that mattered, authority that was earned, recognition that was based on demonstrated competence rather than borrowed influence. My family's belated appreciation was welcome, but no longer necessary, a nice addition to satisfaction that existed independently of their ability to understand or approve. For the first time in my adult life, I felt free from the need to prove myself to people who would never possess the knowledge necessary to evaluate the evidence fairly. The respect I'd been seeking was abundant among people who mattered professionally, available from sources that were qualified to judge my performance according to standards that actually applied to what I did for a living. The black sheep had found her flock, and it was exactly where she'd always belonged. Thanks for watching. If this hit close to home, tap like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs the reminder. Quick questions for you. Have you ever been undermined by family at a big moment? What did you do? Where did you finally draw the line, and how did you hold it? Would you have stayed at the reception after that toast, or walked out? Do you think reconciliation is worth it after public disrespect, or is limited contact the smarter move? Drop your story in the comments, I read them all.